in the afternoon session, we have 3 presentations. We are going to have a break. And our first speakers are David Johnson and Emily Corcoran from Ospar. And they are going to be doing this presentation, Ospar developments regarding management planning for MPAs beyond national jurisdiction. So you can just go ahead. And 20 minutes, please. I'm going to start right now.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. And does this work? Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to do most of the talking, and then Emily's going to do most of the answering of questions. So I firstly wanted to say thank you to the organisers for inviting us. A real pleasure to be part of the MAIA project. And also, Amandine gave a very good explanation to our government contracting parties about the MAIA project in February as a side event to a BDC, a Biodiversity Committee meeting that we held in Brest. We've already heard this morning a couple of mentions of Ospar. I want to explain a little bit what it does, but certainly Fenera highlighted the Ospar area, and also Nuria mentioned the MAIA database and the areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is the subject of this presentation. And this morning also, Gonzalo explained some of the US examples. And in our work, we've drawn upon the National Monument Management Plan, looking at some of the aspects there. Ospar, you know about, I think, most of you in the room, so I won't labour this. Just to say that the Ospar Convention, which is the Oslo and Paris Convention, is responsible for this large area that you can see on the map here. It's 13.5 million square kilometres, but about 40% of that is area beyond national jurisdiction, and something like 83%, just over 80%, is deeper than 200 metres. So we're talking about areas which are a long way away and that are in deep water, that are part of an area that should be representatively covered by marine protected areas to a political target date. And that target was first set in 2003 when the ministers of Ospar and Helcom committed to a coherent and well-managed marine protected area network by 2010. Ospar has a number of strategies, and the important one here is the biodiversity and ecosystem strategy. And we've assessed how well we're doing against those strategies in the Quality Status Report, which was also published in 2010. I think it's important to think philosophically a little bit about what we're doing in terms of protecting vulnerable species and habitats and ecological processes. So I've set out a few issues here in this slide. I think we're gathering momentum hugely in terms of marine protected areas, and the MAIA project is important in that dimension. We need to take back to our policymakers some of the issues that you are experiencing on the ground and that you're reflecting in your debates. But when it comes to investing our efforts, there are different ways that we could do that. We can look at richness and evenness and diversity. We can look at how much of this area is rare or threatened or functional, or indeed all of those things. And we need to ask whether species are actually the appropriate focus for all of these areas. Should it be wider than that? Should we be protecting areas that are particularly important for ecosystem functioning? And we've had those sort of debates in Ospar. One of the kind of key things that's been established within Ospar is a list, and there are many lists, but Ospar has this list of threatened and or declining species and habitats, and in 2010 and 11 we took the first measures to start to protect some of these species and habitats, starting with deep water species and habitats, species that you can see here, like the orange ruffy, important because they have a very slow life cycle maturation, important because they are in deep water and therefore they are endangered insofar as the length of their reproductive cycle is going to impair their survival rate over time. And also we looked at important seabird species, and we've been looking at both of these sets of species and their related habitats, cold water corals and coral gardens, for example, sponge aggregations, in the context of the marine protected areas that have been established. We've also looked at monitoring of biodiversity, but then the third aspect is the marine protected area network. And the marine protected area network within Ospar has been mentioned a couple of times, as I said. We're looking at guidelines and biogeographical classification for how such a network might join together and how it might function in a coherent way. And by May 2010, this was the Ospar network. A lot of marine protected areas established in coastal waters, in territorial waters. You can see big red splodges there in the North Sea and around the UK and around the Azores and to the north around Svalbard in Norway. But many of the sites that are involved in the MAIA project fall into this network. And Ospar has been concerned to try and reach the global CBD target of 10% and still is concerned with that. And also trying to resist the criticism that we're only in it for meeting that target. So that's an important aspect to bear in mind. If we can bring evidence from MAIA back to the table of Ospar, then it's actually showing that it's making a difference. In terms of areas beyond national jurisdiction, this has been a 10-year process, started really in 2000 and started with NGO campaigning, particularly WWF, highlighting the fact that Ospar had its responsibility for area beyond national jurisdiction and drawing attention to synergy with other global selection criteria, such as the FAO vulnerable marine ecosystems and the CBD criteria for species and habitats, and the thinking behind the ecologically or biologically significant areas. So I think that the NGO community within this is a critical catalyst, and WWF were quite clever really. They picked on areas in deep waters that were fishable for their initial scoping, and that included the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, but more controversially, areas to the north, including the Rockall and Hatton banks, and areas towards the Arctic waters. But the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is very important in terms of its representation of bathyal habitat within the northeast Atlantic. And the pilot area, again, as you probably know, was this thing called the Charlie-Gibbs Fracture Zone. And the Charlie-Gibbs Fracture Zone is important for the reasons that are listed in that slide, and was promoted as the area that we would like to protect based upon scientific evidence. It still is the pilot area, but it's been split to north and south in terms of the attention that it was given in the area beyond national jurisdiction. What's also been important is that at the same time as Ospar was looking at marine protected areas, the Regional Fisheries Management Organisation, NIAFC, put in place, based on the same data, the same scientific evidence, bottom fishery closures for almost the same sites. And you can see the overlap there between the suggested Ospar marine protected areas, which are in yellow there, and the NIAF closures, which are in red. And I'll come back to that a bit later on. And what happened in Ospar was that an academic institution, the University of York, based on some very preliminary work by WWF and supported by countries like France, the Netherlands and Germany, built up this evidence and set out the sort of things that we were listening to this morning in terms of conservation objectives, standard stuff for marine protected areas. This was hugely complicated in 2009 by submissions to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, and in particular, those countries that have submissions in the Northeast Atlantic into these deep waters. That includes Portugal, Ireland, the UK, Norway, Iceland, Denmark on behalf of Greenland and Faroes. They therefore had an added political complication into all of this. And the timescales for resolving these submissions to the CLCS are quite uncertain. It can go on for years. CLCS seems to deal with about 3 a year. But at the Ospar ministerial meeting in 2010, the ministers, after this sort of 10-year process, eventually agreed to a set of 6 areas beyond national jurisdiction, and it was those 6 sites that this morning, when Maria was making her presentation, are the ones that don't have management plans. But my point really is that these have taken a long time to negotiate and get through, and this is the first set of such sites in the world. And particularly Portugal should be applauded, if you're keen on establishing marine protected areas, for establishing marine protected areas in association with Ospar for areas where they had put in submissions to the CLCS. And the management recommendations that go together with these marine protected areas, I think, are quite light. So we're talking about awareness building and information exchange, quite common words in Ospar when you're into collaborative areas, but nothing really with hard targets, although there are, for example, management recommendations to put together EIAs and SEAs for new developments. But it's the start. So these have been designated, these 6 areas, and they have management recommendations, and the Ospar countries have to bring together implementation reports for what's happening of their activities in these areas on a yearly basis. So here we are in 2012, and this is the Ospar network, and it's 3.5% of the Ospar maritime area, and you can see that the areas that have been established in areas beyond national jurisdiction are huge compared to those sites around the coastal waters and within the EEZs of the Ospar countries. And they're complemented by these fishery bottom closures. The difference is that the fishery bottom closures are temporary until 2015 and are currently this year being reviewed in terms of how effective they've been. So if the fishery management organisation decides to lift them for any reason, then we're back into a problem. As it is, in terms of management, the perceived main threat to these areas is bottom fishing. So this is good. So we're dealing with areas beyond national jurisdiction. This is blanking out the exclusive economic zone of the countries concerned. And one of the things we have to look at is how coherent is this network. This is a work in progress, but we don't think it's going to be coherent by the target date that ministers set, which is 2012, the end of 2012. There are significant gaps, so there's a lot more to do. But the list, the Ospar list, is quite an important indicator of that coherence. You can see at the bottom there, how many of the species and habitats have been represented. And by 2016, this network should be, again with the political aspiration, should be well managed. So we've started to now work hard at how that's going to happen. How is it going to happen for the areas beyond national jurisdiction? And we need to learn from the other areas. And we need to learn, I think, from the successes of areas within EEZs, the areas that are deeper and further away. And it's important to bring together the relevant competent authorities. So this is a different issue when you're talking about management of these ABNJ areas. It's involving stakeholders who are competent authorities themselves and trying to match the different measures that they've taken. So for the International Maritime Organization, how can you bring in particularly sensitive sea areas and match that with the aims of a marine protected area, for example? How can you pull together joint principles and deliver the ecosystem approach when it comes to these areas? And what sort of action should be taken? How can Ospar, which doesn't have a mandate over fisheries, for example, persuade those that do to take some action on pelagic fisheries? Oh, sorry. So what we've done is we've held 2 meetings now to draw together something which we've called a collective arrangement between the competent authorities. And the first meeting of this was in Madeira in 2010. And it took a long time to try and get some joint principles between the organizations that are exploiting resources on the one hand, and other organisations like Ospar which are protecting the resources. But ultimately, as was said in some of this morning's presentations, we're after the same game. We're after global stewardship of values, and therefore written into all of the mandates of these organisations you can find things which are the same. So, you know, the sustainable use of natural resources, however you interpret that, is written in there. It gives you some common ground to work on. And we started to talk to the other competent authorities, and this little strange house diagram gives you an illustration of some of the issues that might come into a management plan. So can we map the potential fishing footprint when it comes to NIAFC? Can we look at how pelagic fishing might intensify over the years? There's sort of things that they don't really like to do, but as part of this collective arrangement might be possible. Also, at the moment, we don't see any immediate threats to these areas beyond national jurisdiction, but it might be that if the International Seabed Authority issue licenses for polymetallic sulfides, then all of this work goes west if it's not properly agreed. So we're in that debate at the moment and trying to pull together an arrangement where all of these organisations pull together, and trying to make sure that we get some sort of a management plan into a standardised format. So we're a long way behind with ABNJ, the formats and the guidelines that have been put together for the MPAs that we've been talking about already within the MAIA project. We're also actively debating how on earth we're going to enforce surveillance and enforcement in these areas. When you think about a research cruise day at £45,000 or whatever it costs, then it takes 12 days to get out to any of these areas. So you're into huge, if you're into normal surveillance and enforcement measures, you're into huge cost. So we've got to look elsewhere. We've got to look at remote sensing. We must look at how platforms can be established that might deliver periodic monitoring, for example, unmanned aircraft, drones, or for example, this station here, the bottom picture, which is called Sensor, which is a mobile station. And the Marine Conservation Biological Institute in Washington have done some work on this. Sandra Brook came and discussed with us, well, how are we going to deliver this when it comes to some of these areas? And more importantly, who's going to pay for it, and how readily can we exchange information? I think it was interesting earlier that Michael was saying, well, within an administration, it's very difficult to exchange information. Well, it's extremely difficult to start exchanging information between competent authorities. Exchange of VMS data, for example, is not easy. So the second meeting of this Madeira process was held earlier this year, and this was particularly focusing on what structure can we put together for a management plan. And it drew upon the management guidelines that were referred to by Nuria earlier. But these aren't appropriate for ABNJ. They have to be modified. And particularly, we started to run that against a test case for one of the marine protected areas, and start to look at how we could gather information. And Emily might pick this up a bit later on, but there are problems with that. How do we establish what the activities are there? Who's going to take care of the administration for those, and what sort of time frame are we looking at? Do we need to rethink perhaps the implementation reporting? I think one of the most pressing issues is biotechnology developments in these areas, access to deep water genetic resources, and that falls within kind of nobody wants to look after it, but I think legally it falls into the Ospar remit, and Ospar needs to perhaps take a lead on this, and that won't be at all popular when it comes to those companies that are starting to patent genetic resources in deep water environments. So final slide then, some conclusions and lessons learned from this. One is that I haven't really been talking about management plans very much, which was the basis of the talk. That's because it's taken so long to establish these marine protected areas, and I think it will take so long to get the management plans together as well. So our little nil in the MAIA database might stay that way for a while. I think we need to have proxy science as well to check that, for example, seamounts where we think there is strong biodiversity, we need to send down ROVs, survey them, photograph them, but also transfer that information as part of a management plan. There is definitely a role for champions in all of this, people that are going to stick their neck out and have some kind of engagement with these areas that people know very little about. And then the final bullet point there, I think we need to establish reference areas for deep sea pelagic species and habitats. And we need to avoid micromanaging fisheries. We've got very big areas here, so it needs bold management actions. I think we need to be speaking the same language as the other competent authorities, and it's important that we have some sort of practice and exchange of information and then link it to the marine protected areas in EEZs and in waters closer to shore. I've used all the time, but I'm going to hand over to Emily just to maybe say a few words before we answer any questions.
Thank you. I know that we're limited on time, so I'll keep it short. There are a couple of points that I wanted to pick up on that David referred to earlier in terms of more specifically on the framework that's being established within the context of the Madeira process and where we've got to on that. One of the things that was very obvious from the meeting that took place in Paris, that in order to achieve this, or any kind of coordination in terms of management, it's going to require a new level of coordination at a national level between ministries, so that because a number of the all the competent authorities that have responsibilities in the Northeast Atlantic, of course, have very similar contracting parties. And so this is a big challenge that we'll be facing. And also that this is very much breaking new ground in terms of managing stuff going on which is in international waters, and there's not really a precedence for this. There are some very large areas which have been established, but they've been established principally with national jurisdiction. So the Hawaiian Islands example is very remote, and there are a lot of shared experiences that we can draw upon. But again, we don't have this issue of it being outside of national jurisdiction. In terms of where we are at the moment, we've used Charlie Gibbs again as a bit of a front runner, trying to, I think it was Gonzalo, you mentioned before that management plans need to be put in context. So in order to try and test where we've got to with this, we have a structure of a framework that could form the basis of a management plan and be the tool, the end product of the process. And then to test it, we're applying this to the Charlie Gibbs South region to see how it could work, what it means, who would be in charge of this management plan, who would be leading the coordination between the competent authorities, and see if we can start to tackle some of the more practical aspects of having management in these far, far away areas. Yeah, and the last point is just to reinforce what you were saying, David, about time and the time that's going to be needed. Timescale of these things is going to be long and needs to have a longer time perspective, which has implications for funding and money as well as policy as well. But I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I know it's... in the afternoon session, we have 3 presentations. We are going to have a break. And our first speakers are David Johnson and Emily Corcoran from Ospar. And they are going to be doing this presentation, Ospar developments regarding management planning for MPAs beyond national jurisdiction. So you can just go ahead, and 20 minutes, please. I'm going to start right now.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. And does this work? Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to do most of the talking, and then Emily's going to do most of the answering of questions. So I firstly wanted to say thank you to the organisers for inviting us. A real pleasure to be part of the MAIA project. And also, Amandine gave a very good explanation to our government contracting parties about the MAIA project in February as a side event to a BDC, a Biodiversity Committee meeting that we held in Brest. We've already heard this morning a couple of mentions of Ospar. I want to explain a little bit what it does, but certainly Fenera highlighted the Ospar area, and also Nuria mentioned the MAIA database and the areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is the subject of this presentation. And this morning also, Gonzalo explained some of the 40% of that is area beyond national jurisdiction, and something like 83%, just over 80%, is deeper than 200 meters. So we're talking about areas which are a long way away and that are in deep water, that are part of an area that should be representatively covered by marine protected areas to a political target date. And that target was first set in 2003 when the ministers of the US examples, and in our work we've drawn upon the National Monument Management Plan, looking at some of the aspects there. Ospar you know about, I think, most of you in the room, so I won't labour this, just to say that the Ospar Convention, which is the Oslo and Paris Convention, is responsible for this large area that you can see on the map here. It's 13.5 million square kilometres, but about